Morning, everybody. All right. Chapter 13 of Romans is our epistle lesson today, and it, I think, always deserves some attention. So I want to give it some of our attention today. And particularly, this is regarding civil authority, the relationship between God and civil authority and us and civil authority. And so we're going to talk about that in the context of Paul's letter here, but also in the much more complicated context in which we find ourselves in the United States today. I also want to take a look at two Psalms that will treat of the obligations of a ruler. Normally, we think about our obligations to be subject to the powers that be, but and the New Testament has next to nothing to say about what the obligations of a ruler are, because at the time of Jesus and the apostles, Christians being rulers was just not really contemplated. That was not something that was going to happen for some time. So there isn't anything in the New Testament that gives any guidance on how to be a just and godly ruler. But there is some places in the Old Testament. Particularly, I want to look at two Psalms. We'll take a look at that. Okay. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That always, on the one hand, we should say, of course, but on the other hand, American ears are not necessarily all attuned to that. All authorities are established by God. Furthermore, it says, therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Okay? Now, so we do want to understand this in its context, and then we want to understand and look at, well, how does that relate to us today? Okay, are we allowed to throw the bums out, for example? Because that's a common refrain in American politics. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. In other words, it's not just that you're trying to avoid being thrown in the clink. You're supposed to behave because it's right and good that you obey the authorities. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Okay. So, what jumps to mind as I read that as possibly problematic? Hitler? Okay. Okay. So we're looking at bad apples. It says that he does good. There's no fear for those who do good, but wrongdoers beware, because he does not bear the sword in vain. And then we look at the examples of history and we say, well, wait a minute. What about this? And what about that? And is it true that civil authorities always hold terror for those who do wrong and uphold and support those who do right? Would that it were so. Now, This was written to the Romans, to the church at Rome, at a time when there was not even, democracy was not even in the twinkling in anybody's eye, okay? Who was in charge? Who's the civil authorities and the rulers that God has appointed? The one that sort of rears his head most when we read this. Who would have the Romans have thought? Yeah, Caesar. Caesar. Okay? So when he says he's a minister of God and an agent of God and a servant of God, and he doesn't bear the sword for nothing, he's not talking about King David. Okay? He's talking about the Roman emperor. Now, he's not pretending, and it's not as though Paul is not aware that the Roman emperor does not always do what is right. And like politicians and people in power throughout the years, it's often the case that the ones for whom they hold terror are their political enemies, and the ones for whom they hold favors are their political allies, and who's good and who's bad has little to do with it. I'm being very cynical, but that is often the case even today, more than we wish it were. Okay? So the first thing that we Christians, when we read that, we say, well, that sounds good, but is that true? Now, I begin by saying, I put up there the fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. Now, this civil authority has long been related to the fourth commandment, and this is why. The fourth commandment is not about just our mothers and fathers. It's about those to whom we owe obedience. Those who are above us and those who came before us, okay? Our parents are sort of a microcosm of the entire society. If you are raised in a society, your parents are going to tell you, here are the people to be respected, here are the powers that be, here is how and what the law is, here is how you fit in. I mean, they're going to teach you this directly and by example. When your parents obey the law, okay, then they teach their children to obey the law. What the parents teach the children is right and wrong. The children learn is right and wrong. So the parents become the focal point of two things. Number one, they are, from childhood until you reach majority, they are the ones who sort of all of society's power structures and authority are merged into them. You understand what I mean? For the kid doesn't deal directly with presidents, governors, police officers, or anything. They just deal with the parents. And the parents, in the parents, are the whole rest of society's structure, all of it right there. This is what is so important about parents raising up their children to be good citizens or failing to do so. If you raise them up to be good citizens, then that means that they've learned well from their parents who the good guys are and how we're supposed to do, and who the bad guys are and who we're supposed to resist. We learn that from the parents. And then hopefully, when you grow up, you realize, hey, that's right. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. This is what society is all about. So in the parents is the whole social structure of society. That's why we have to be very careful. And these are getting difficult times in this, because we're becoming so polarized that no matter who's president, half the country holds them in contempt. When you hold the president in contempt, you act like you hold the president in contempt. When you act like you hold the president in contempt, your children and grandchildren see that you hold the president in contempt, and they learn to hold the president in contempt if you don't like him, which is a problem. Of course, the opposite is also true. Raising up good children, good citizens, means we have people who go to the polls, vote responsibly, understand civic responsibility, don't throw trash on the side of the road, obey speed limit signs, and do all the other things, pay their taxes without cheating and all that kind of stuff. So this is good. Parents also, in parents, are merged all of a society's heritage. It's not just the parents, it's the grandparents. It's the great-grandparents, it's the great-great-grandparents. It's the great-great-great-great-grandparents. As we raised our kids, we taught them, quite by accident, to talk. What language did we teach them? Well, we taught them English. How come? Because that's what we were taught. Because that's what our parents were taught, and that's what their parents were taught, and that's what their parents were taught. We taught them English. We taught them normal ways of what's right and wrong. We didn't take out the penal code. We taught them what's right and wrong. Well, where did we learn what's right and wrong? Well, from our parents. Where did they learn? From their parents. Where did they learn? From their parents. So parents are not just a representation of the social structure. They are also a representation of the heritage. What you learn from your parents is our heritage. You learn that George Washington cannot tell a lie. You learn that democracy is the best form of government. You learn that America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and all this kind of stuff. You learn this because your parents communicate, or they don't. If they don't, then you learn something else. So either we are passing down a heritage that we're proud of, or maybe we're passing down a heritage that we're proud of, but with some asterisks here or there, okay? Or maybe we just don't bother passing down a heritage at all and let every generation reinvent themselves however they want. That's a foolish thing to do, but that's what some people do, okay? So when we're talking about Christians' obligations to the authorities, we're not just talking about a person. We're talking about how we fit in to the structures of society which are above us and have been before us. I've mentioned before that deeply embedded in the whole concept of God and society is conservatism with a small c. That is to say, that society tries to pass on and preserve and conserve what's good. That doesn't mean that whatever came before is good and that we look at it uncritically, but it means that we do not reinvent. We do not assume that this generation knows better than the last generation. So we'll just, whatever they did, who cares? We're going to do it our way. That is not a godly way to act. And the fourth commandment speaks against that kind of thing. You're to honor your father and mother. You're to honor your previous generations. We are to honor the founding fathers. I mean, in that sense. You honor the founding fathers. You honor the Magna Carta. You honor the Greeks and the Romans. Whatever it is in your heritage, you honor. You don't just uncritically accept it as all good, but you recognize that this is God's gift to you. Your world would be a much worse place if you didn't have it. Now, also with the fourth commandment, there is an assumption going on. And then we have to bring that assumption into Romans chapter 13. Let's take a look at the situation of parents. Children are to honor their parents. There is an assumption behind that. The assumption is that the parents are doing what parents are supposed to do. Now, what are parents supposed to do? First and foremost, as far as the Lord is concerned, what are parents supposed to do? Train their children up in the fear and discipline of the Lord. Okay? So in other words, if there's one thing about our heritage that should be preserved and conserved, it will be our knowledge and our, the faith of our fathers. We hand that down. We make sure we go to church, our children go to church, their children go to church, and so on and so on and so on. The assumption is, in the fourth commandment, that you honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Why? Because your parents are teaching the things that are necessary to live long in the land. What is that? To walk with your God in faith. To know who it is that brought you into this land and who will keep you there. Your parents will teach you why idolatry is evil and why this God is to be worshipped. Your parents will teach you that. You must honor them and obey them, because if you don't, the assumption is if you're not going to honor and obey your parents, then you're not going to honor what they see or teach or were commissioned by God to deliver to you. So to bow up against your parents is to bow up against the Lord, because through your parents you learned about the Lord. And if you won't listen to them, well, then all bets are off. Okay? If this generation of Israelites will not listen to their parents, then this generation of Israelites will lapse into idolatry and will incur wrath that they could have avoided had they simply listened to their parents. But what is the assumption here about the parents? That they are doing what they're supposed to do. Okay? When it says honor your father and mother, it's assuming that the father and mother are doing what fathers and mothers are supposed to do. Well, what if a father and mother decide not to teach you about the Lord or to commit an idolatry themselves? Then what? Well, okay, that's not dealt with in the brief little, fourth commandment. But we know what the answer is. If mom and dad want to be idolaters, the children must not follow them. Right? Jesus says, whoever loves even your mother or father more than me is not worthy of me. I mean, that's exactly what he's talking about. If your father and your mother want to go after other gods or do whatever else is just faithless to Christ, and you follow them because, well, you love them and you rather have their favor than mine, then you're not worthy of me. That's exactly what he's talking about. We must obey God rather than man, is how the apostles put it. When they were commanded by rightful civil authority to stop preaching Christ, and they said, well, we must obey God rather than man, which means we're going to disobey you, okay, rather than honor you. Okay, so it gets complicated when the parents are not doing what they're supposed to do, or more typically, when they sometimes do and sometimes don't, and some ways do and some days don't, okay? So it gets complicated, doesn't it? So you can't just say to a child, whatever your parents taught you, that you must do. But you also can't say to them, hey, your parents are one thing and you're another, so you make up your own mind. We do not raise our children carefully. As Christians, we do not raise our children carefully. And then when they get to 18, we say, now you make up your own mind. How common it is in our society today for parents to say, just on religious issues, I'm going to let my children make up their own mind. Okay? I'm going to raise them up, but I'm not going to try to force anything on them, and I'll let them make up their own mind. I mean, you've completely failed as a parent to do that. You think that you're being open-minded and teaching kids to be open-minded. What you've really done is failed to give them something to believe in, and then allow them to, make it up anew. Did any of us make up the Christian faith? It was passed down. It's been passed down through many, many generations. So anybody who wants to be an innovator of the Christian faith is abandoning the Christian faith because there's nothing innovative here. There's nothing new in the 21st century that we didn't have before. It's all been passed down to us, and either we receive it or we don't. So what is the case for parents and children, and this little microcosm, is also the case with government. When the government does what it's supposed to do, then what does the government do? Well, it beats down wrongdoing, and it rewards good behavior. Does Caesar have any idea what good and bad behavior is? Yes. Now, he doesn't know anything about the gospel, but he's not in charge of the church. But does he know the difference between murder and not murder? Does he know the difference between communities helping and supporting and not? Between courage and a lack of courage? Between somebody who knifes you in the back and somebody who... Yes, he knows that. So the government has a responsibility to our bodies, not to our souls. And you don't have to be a Christian to know that there are certain things that people need. And, a government like Stalin, who decides that for the best of tomorrow, the next generation, we're just going to starve 3/4 of this generation because you got to break some eggs in order to make an omelet. I mean, that is a failure to understand what the government's role is. You are sacrificing people in order to implement your programs when your programs are supposed to be there to preserve life, not destroy it. So we can all see very obvious examples when government just flat fails to do the most basic thing that it's supposed to do, as when it turns against its own people. But there's another word that we might use in connection with government. Government should do justice, right? Reward good behavior, punish bad behavior. Justice, that's what we mean by that. according to the ability of a king or an emperor or a governor or whatever to do. So that's what you do. Now, Romans chapter 13 is not treating of all the situation. Well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? It's using the basic scenario. This is why God institutes government. Even worse than a bad government is no government. No government is chaos, and we live like animals, okay? So even a bad government we ought to thank God for, because it's better to have bad laws and bad rules than no laws and no rules, because then it is the law of the jungle. Now, that doesn't let the government off the hook. The government has a job under God. Even if the government and the emperor doesn't believe in God, God is still going to judge them if the emperor determines that he's going to break some eggs here, because he doesn't care. In order to maintain power, whoever has to die has to die. It's just the way it goes. That's not justice. If in order to maintain your position, you pervert justice, God will judge governments. Think about how important it is in an American concept of government that there is a God who makes the rules. How do you hold a government accountable if the king makes the rules? If whatever the king says is the law, how do you judge the king as wrong? Now, in Israel, the king was never allowed to make the law. In fact, the king was commanded to read the law of Moses regularly, because the king was under the law of Moses. David got reprimanded many times by the Lord for various things that he did that did not rise to the level of what a servant of God should do. So in Israel, kings were not above the law. But in other ancient Near Eastern countries, they were. And the emperor in Rome was above the law. Now, what Paul is saying is, well, no, he's not. He may think so, they may say so, but he's not. So for our Christian point of view, is that we will obey the civil authorities even when they're stupid and even when they're wrong, if we can. When can we not? When can you not, as a Christian, obey civil authority, whoever it is?
When they're going against God's law and what God wants us to do.
Okay. The standard sort of ancient teaching on this is, if civil authority, whether it's the emperor or your parents, if they command you to do something that God forbids, you cannot obey. If they forbid you to do something that God commands, you cannot obey. There is a lot in between. Okay? There's a lot in between where God does not forbid this and they are commanding it, and I think it's stupid and unfair. And you know what? You may be right. It's stupid, it's unfair. But we Christians do not get to obey the laws that we think are right and fair and not obey the laws that we don't think are right and fair, even if the emperor is an idolater, a pagan who doesn't care about God, okay? And you hope that the idolater and the pagan is mostly going to do what's right. And understand that even terrible dictators, still most of what they do is sort of basic governance, which we all need, even if they're engaged in all kinds of evil elsewhere. So there is still reason to recognize that even in bad governments, the blessing of the Lord is to be found, and the judgment of the Lord will still be upon that bad governance. Okay? Any thoughts on that? This basic idea of the fourth commandment and its relationship here. This does not, look, trust me, if you want to go to law school, you'll learn all the ins and outs where, and you're never going to get to the point where you say, okay, well, that's the answer. No, you're never going to get to where that's the answer. There is an infinite number of, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about, it's always going to be that way. Okay? And I don't want you to read Romans 13 simplistically. Oh, well, you just have to do what you're told, and that's that. You know, like the Nazis said, well, we just did what we were told. Well, that's not going to work. Okay? That's not going to work. Okay. We've talked about the governing authorities, agents and ministers of God. Okay? Now, in an American concept, where does the authority to govern come from? Right. We say, no, it doesn't come from God, it comes from us. Are those irreconcilable? To say that the powers that be are instituted by God, does that mean you can't have an election? But doesn't that cut God out of the loop? All right, let's take a look at Caesar here. Caesar wasn't elected, was he? He's instituted by God. Do you know what that means? That one day everybody was standing outside in Rome wondering who's going to lead us, and then out of heaven dropped this man. It's Caesar. He's been instituted by God. Now that would be easy, wouldn't it? How did Caesar get his position? Well, there were wars, and there were lots of politics. Did anybody elect Caesar? Yes, in a manner of speaking. But it wasn't the public. It was the other powers that be. Somebody's going to have to rule us. So if you wanted to be Caesar, you can't just, you're not going to have a vote of everybody. But it's not like you can just, I want to be Caesar, God has instituted me, that'll work. It doesn't work that way. You've got to get the favor of the people with power who will back you, and then, that might be the powerful households in Rome, the moneyed people and all that. It might be the military. How many times does a king or a emperor get installed because his military beat their military? Okay? So, if you're in a coup and you overthrow the government, which was instituted by God, and now you're the government, are you instituted by God? Evidently so, otherwise most governments in times past, I mean, how else did they get there? Every now and then, you would have a nice peaceful transfer of power. The king would have a son, and he would grow up, and the king would die in old age, and everybody would love the son, and the son would begin to govern, and everything would be fine. That's the exception and not the rule. So if kings can become kings and the instrument of God by a coup, or because they had more guns than the other side, or because they were able to do politicking better, or because they came from, a very powerful family, if that can be the basis of selecting our ruler who is God's instrument, then why not an election? So there's nothing about an election that cuts God out of anything. But it is true that in our country, we prefer to have elections determine who's going to rule rather than birth or coups. Okay, we prefer neither of those. But somehow or another, we're going to have somebody. In our country, the person at the top is only at the top in a manner of speaking. Because, of course, the president of our country is not like the emperor. He doesn't run everything. He runs some things. And he actually has to constantly work with all kinds of other people who are running all kinds of other things. And the reality is power in our country is not so centralized in one man as what here. So, but it's not, when it says the powers that be, it means the powers, not just one. There are lots of powers. By the way, did the emperor in Rome, was he an absolute dictator? Or did he have to work with other powerful people? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. If you think that, why in the olden days, they just said whatever they said and everybody just did whatever he said, that's just not how it was. Study a little Roman history. It's not just Rome. It's anywhere. If you want to rule, you better have the right people backing you. And if you don't have the right people backing you, you're going to find out just how lonely it is being at the top and how shortly you will be there, okay? You got to have people supporting you. How do you get people to support you? Well, I mean, you give them what they want, okay? You're better than the alternative. You butter them up. You threaten them. You pit different parties against one another. Whatever you have to do, I mean, that's just how the game is played. How do you get in top today? How do you get in charge? Similar deal. We just try to avoid the guns. Okay, we want to go with the guns and the murder, but all the other stuff is still with us. Okay? Nobody just says, I'm going to be president because. You better have the right people backing you, or you're not going to be there. And when you get to be the president, are you still beholden to the people who put you there? Yes, you are. Okay? I mean, that's just the way the world is. Okay. So we've been talking about, but that doesn't, notice, Paul was perfectly aware of everything I'm saying. It's not like he had this Pollyannish idea of how things worked. He understood how Rome operated, and he understood how Herod operated, and he understood how government works. But that's what he wrote. So we Christians don't deny that all these unsavory things are happening, and all these very ungodly things are happening. We don't deny that. We also don't deny that underneath this, there is the hand of God. That's not an imprimatur. It is not a stamp of approval on all that they're doing. It's just recognizing that God moves in mysterious ways, and this man might have been put in that place by accident of birth, or because his army was bigger than his army, or because the way the stars aligned at that particular time. This is what the powerful families in Rome wanted, so that's the guy, okay? Doesn't matter. We Christians still have a duty. Now, I want to turn to a couple of Psalms. And these Psalms, the first one is going to be Psalm 101. These two Psalms are going to deal with the issue of rulers. The first one, Psalm 101, is a description by a king, presumably King David, of what a good king should do. Okay? So, I'll read. Psalm 101. I will sing of steadfast love and justice. To you, O Lord, I will make music. David is singing this, and it is his celebration of what his job is as a king. I will ponder the way that is blameless. Oh, when will you come to me? Saying to God, speaking to God. I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. So within my own, those that are close to me, I will walk with integrity of heart. I, the king. Note, I'm not above the law. I don't get to do whatever I wish to do. Off with his head, that sort of stuff. I'm going to walk with integrity through my house. I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. So the idea that the king can, if he wants, spend all of his days with video games or delicacies and stuff like that, rather than pondering important things that are going to be necessary in order to govern. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. A perverse heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. Now, this is the king making promises about what he wants to be. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be this way, but this psalm is telling us what ought to be on the king's heart. Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure. So in other words, I'm going to surround myself with good people. I'm going to favor good people. And I'm going to be against the evil and the arrogant and the wicked and so on. I will look with favor on the faithful in the land. So if you're faithful to God, he doesn't just mean having faith, but having faith and walking with God. You're trying to be a decent person, in other words, following the law. I will favor them, that they may dwell with me in this land. Say, I'm the king in Israel, and if people want to dwell happily with me, then be like me, faithful to God and walk in your integrity. And I'm your friend. If you're the friend of God, I'm your friend. If you're not, I'm not. He who walks in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. Okay? So who am I going to put in my cabinet posts? Okay? Who am I going to appoint to this and that and the other thing? Well, those whose way is blameless. Again, he doesn't mean without sin. but he does mean that they are lawful, decent people trying to do the right thing. The opposite of this is, whoever gives me the biggest bribe, I will put in this position. Whoever gives me the next biggest bribe, I'll put in that position. To whoever the people who supported me, I will make sure that they get positions in the government and good emoluments and so forth like that, regardless of whether they deserve it or not. That would be the opposite of this, okay? No one who practices deceit shall dwell in my house. No one who utters lies shall continue before my eyes. Morning by morning I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. So in other words, I, as the king, my job is to advance justice and goodness, to be a friend of those who are all about justice and goodness, to be an enemy of those who are causing problems and faithless and worthless and arrogant and all the rest. And that's my job, and I'm going to surround myself with good people, and I'm going to work with them, and I'm going to keep worthless things out of my eyes in life, because first and foremost, if the king is going to do all these good things with the people, he himself has to be good. Okay? Psalm 101. Got that? If you were a king, that would be a good. You don't have to be a king. I mean, think about this. Does this work if you're just a businessman? You have a business and you have 100 employees. Does this work? And the answer is, well, yeah. I mean, you might have to adjust it some, because a businessman doesn't have all the same tools. He doesn't wield the sword, usually. But the principle is the same. You might even say, hey, the principle is the same for a parent. I'm going to raise up my family. I got all these kids and grandkids and all that. And that means that I also have got to tend to my own life and to my own heart, and to do justice in my own family. So this makes sense. But this psalm is assuming, it's assuming a good king who wants to be a good king. All right? Now, let's take a look at Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is also about kingship. But it will be God judging kings that are not being good kings. Now, I should point out that the title Son of God was regularly used in the Old Testament to refer to the king. Okay? Not when we say Son of God, when Jesus was called the Son of God, the initial, first, most obvious application of that is, you are the Christ, the King. Not, you are divine. The reason why we Christians say that Jesus is divine is not because he called himself the Son of God. Other reasons are there. But we will see here in Psalm 82, God is going to address the sons of God. He's not talking to divine people. He's not talking to angels either. You'll see. So in Psalm 2, when it says, you are my son, today I have begotten you, okay, the reference there, and that was used, God said that in Jesus' baptism. The point there isn't you are divine. The point here is you are my unique agent, okay? You are ruling on my behalf. That's what that meant. Psalm 82. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. All right, so there's all these gods. Who are these gods? Well, they are the various rulers. They are the various people. They are the movers and shakers, okay? They are the ones, the pillars, the ones that we all look up to, the ones that make things happen. That's who the council of the gods are. Whether we call them kings or princes, or the particular wealthy, influential people, doesn't matter. But who is over all of them? God has taken his place in the divine council. So it's like, this is an image of God gathering all these important people, all these movers and shakers in society, gathering them all in one big room, big council, and now God has taken his place in their midst. Who's in charge? God's in charge. Okay, so that's the number one thing we understand, is that the movers and shakers are movers and shakers only relatively speaking. God is the mover and shaker. What does he say? Verse 2, God addresses the council of the movers and shakers. He says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? That's God calling to account, calling on the carpet, all of these princes and kings and so on. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. That's what you should be doing. And you're not. You're favoring the rich. You're favoring your friends. You're taking bribes. You're corrupting everything. You are sons of God. I put you here not for that purpose, but in order to take care of the weak, in order to take care of the oppressed, and to do justice. And you're not doing that. So this is God's admonition against the movers and shakers. Verse 5. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. So that's his comment, God's comment. These people don't know what they're doing. They don't care. The foundations, the rulers are the foundations of our society, and they're shaky. Verse 6. I said, this is God speaking, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. In other words, your authority and your agency, your authority comes from me and you're my agents. And this is what I wanted you to do, and you're not doing it. I said, you are God, sons of God, of the Most High, every one of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. So this is interesting because, here we have explicitly, you're not divine, and you're not above the law, and you are here for a purpose, and if you do not fulfill that purpose, then God will judge you. Okay, the king, the princes, the powerful are not above the law. They are not above justice. They are not above and out of God's reach. Verse 8 is the cry of the psalmist. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. Okay, so it's a cry of frustration because the psalmist is looking out at the world and seeing that all of these people who should be serving God for the sake of us all are instead lining their own pockets and doing what they want, but God will judge them. Okay? Any thoughts on this? Psalm 82, that's what Psalm 82 says. Okay, we've talked about the governing authorities. Their job is to take care of our bodies. Not to get us into heaven, but to take care of human life. As far as the Scripture is concerned, human life is sacred, even if Caesar doesn't recognize that. It doesn't matter. Your job as Caesar is to protect human life. That means more than just keeping people alive, of course. A good economy is really important to protecting and preserving human life. Lots of people die when the economy goes really, really south, okay? Keeping out of wars that we shouldn't be in, or engaging in wars when we should engage in them, are all a part of protecting life. Law and order is a part of life. Maintaining stability in society is necessary to protect life. Avoiding corruption in all the system, like what we just saw here, so that the rulers and authorities and powers are there for good reason, rather than because everybody's scratching everybody else's back, and if you don't have anybody to scratch your back, then too bad for you. Okay? All of this is what government should do. Our obligation, of course, is to be subject to all of this. Now, God has had many kinds of authorities, many more than that. But here's the thing. Now, here's a tricky thing about being a part of our republic. If you are a Christian in Rome, the ordinary Christian, there really isn't any debate about who you're going to vote for or what policies you're going to support in the next election. We're going to find out what again, not just the emperor, but the powers that be in Rome, what they're going to do. And if their next move is, we need to round up the Christians and start burning some of them, bad news for us. Okay, but like we're not voting for this or voting against it. Nobody's going to ask you. For the most part, in the ancient world, and up until relatively recently, nobody asked the ordinary person. You just hoped that the rulers did what was right. Now, in the Western world, where Christianity really took root, the people might very well believe the king is quite evil. But you still have to live with whatever he does. In other parts of the world, maybe you just said that I don't like the king, but you didn't recognize the king necessarily as God's agent. In the Western world, you might say, yes, the king is God's agent, and the king is failing God, and will be judged by God. But I can't judge you. I have no power. So most Christians could recognize the difference between good and bad policies and good and bad governance, but they themselves were either beneficiaries or victims of it, but they weren't participants in it. You see? But in America, it's a little different. Who is the ultimate? I mean, God is the ultimate authority. But if we were to say from a human point of view, what's the ultimate authority in our nation? Yeah, it would be the Constitution, right? It's no particular. It's not. You can't say the president. Presidents come and presidents go. The president is here to do what? To be faithful and to defend the Constitution and to carry out the will of the people and so on according to the Constitution. So the Constitution is this thing that binds the president, but also binds the rest of us. But of course, the Constitution and anybody who is put in a position of authority is also to be judged by God. And of course, the Constitution cannot trump what is God's own law. So, of course, the original founders of the Constitution did not think that there was anything about their Constitution that ran afoul of God's law. All right. So, for us, Christians, there's another wrinkle in this country. Because when we think about Psalm 101 or Psalm 82, we can't just say, oh, well, that's about the king and the powers to be. Because we also have a role in how our country is governed. Okay? Your votes and my votes, the opinions we express to others, the efforts that we make to win people over to a particular side or a particular party or to a particular policy or whatever, we become partly responsible for whatever's happening. Which means that a Christian needs to be careful about what they support or not support. You can't just say, well, that's the powers that be and I'll just live with whatever's here. So if we vote people into office who are publicly saying, I mean, this has been my thing for a long time. If you're a politician saying that I think that a woman should be able to get an abortion if she wants it between her and her doctor, nothing else matters, and you vote for that, you are participating in that. You can't possibly say that that's a godly thing. And you may have your reasons for doing what you're doing, but you can't possibly say that that's a godly thing. But people are voting for this. And as an American, I mean, you and I share responsibility for whatever of that we're voting for, supporting. That's a simple example. There are lots of other examples. I mean, you know, whether you talk about what our drug policy is or whether we go to war in Ukraine or anything else. I mean, all the stuff that goes along with governance in this country, whatever government we're supporting, if we're supporting government that is doing right, then good. And if we're supporting government that is not, then we bear partial responsibility for that. What I'm saying here is that's an added wrinkle that isn't even contemplated in Romans chapter 13. But it is part and parcel with what it means to be here. We have to vote. The Christians in Rome did not have a vote. So nobody asked them. If they did, then you might look to something like Psalm 101 and say, well, what should a good king do? Or go back to, into the scriptures and say, well, what ought we to support and what ought not we to support? And recognize that we can be complicit in corruption also. If we are voting, for example, if you're voting for somebody who you don't think is a very good person, but it's good for you, you have to ask yourself, is that what a good king would do? The answer is, well, no. So if the only reason why I'm voting for this person is because, well, they promised to get rid of my debt or whatever, even though you say it's probably not very good for the country, but it'd be good for me, I'm voting for it. That we have a responsibility that has to rise above that, because governance is about justice and about helping the weak and the vulnerable, but about justice for all, and it's about being agents of God. So in that sense, whenever we are voting let me put it this way, just don't reduce the whole thing to voting. When we are involved in the political process, formally or informally, when we are talking to other family members about what we ought to be supporting, what kind of a nation we ought to have, what are good laws and what are not, when we're doing any of that, we are exercising in a very tiny way what kings were supposed to do. Then we have to understand as Christians, well, what are kings supposed to do? Because that's what we're doing now. And we can do it well and in a godly way. And we can be just as corrupt and greedy as everybody else. Or we can just drop out and say, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Or we can say, I'll vote for whoever gives me the biggest check. There's all kinds of ways that we as individual Christians can be a part of a corrupt process or part of a good process. We can leaven the process, or we can make it worse. And these are added wrinkles that are simply not contemplated when Paul says, hey, the powers that be have got to be subject to them. Okay? All right. Let's quit now, because if I do, then I've left ourselves enough time. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, help us as citizens in this country, where you yourself, O Lord, have instituted the powers that be, which include this wonderful Constitution that we are under, and the particular people that are in offices throughout our land and in all of our states and in all of our communities. Lord, the powers that be in our nation are there, and they have a responsibility to you, whether they know it or not, whether they like it or not. We pray that you would grant to our leaders wisdom to do the right thing, even if they don't know why. We pray that you would rule our land through them, that you would protect and preserve human life and allow such peace and prosperity so that your kingdom may continue to come. We lift them all up before you and we pray for them, Lord. We also pray for ourselves, because we are part of this process and we are also subject to the process. So help us to be wise rulers to the extent that we are rulers, and wise and obedient subjects to the extent that we are subjects. And help us in all things, Lord, to give honor and glory to you. Amen.